It is currently 1 in the morning here. This is completely improvised. Unfortunately, I also have a bit of a cold, so I have a cough and a sore throat. I'm sorry if that comes across really strong in the audio here. But I realized that we are vastly approaching Halloween for this year, and it's kind of flown completely by me. I haven't really even taken note of the season until today, or taken advantage of it in the way that I usually would in binging horror films or things along those ideas. So what I wanted to do today was just quickly throw together a product to honor Halloween in that way. A couple years back, now it's 5 years back or so, when I made my Supertramp video. No, it was before that. It was when I made my not like this matters. It was when I made my Scary Stories in the Dark video. I had talked about how I wanted to do a video on my favorite horror films, and I was going to get around to that super quickly. That is not something I ended up getting around to super quickly, but it is something I want to talk about today, just to have a video for Halloween this year, and to have something to discuss regarding film and regarding horror and all that, because horror is unapologetically one of my favorite genres, if not my absolute favorite genre. It has had such a huge impact on me, profoundly shaped me as a person. And of course, a big part of that is through film. So today I'm just going to kind of go through a lot of my favorite horror movies and give brief reviews, brief suggestions, brief analyses of each of them. The first one that comes up, and I think a lot of these top ones are very tied for me. It's very close. But the one I'm going to talk about first is The Innocents. Now, this is a 1961 black and white film. It's directed by Jack Clayton, I believe, who also did Something Wicked This Way Comes, and I think he did the original 70s Great Gatsby. Not original, I guess there was a silent Great Gatsby. But this is an adaptation of a Henry James short story, one of his most famous, The Turn of the Screw, which is about a English governess who comes to this house in the country to look after these very, very bourgeois children that are being taken care of by their uncle, I believe. And they're kind of haunted by the ghost of the former governess and her demonic lover, as it were. But it's unclear if the ghosts are real or not. If our current governess, who's played by Deborah Kerr fantastically, is going mad and projecting these ghosts from her own past onto these innocent children. And that's where a lot of the horror comes from, is the interplay between the falling apart psychology of our main character and the genuine horror of what is essentially child abuse, either way you look at it, whether it's supernatural or literal. And the thing that really stands out to me about The Innocents, even rewatching it now, is the brilliant cinematography of it. It's a widescreen film, and it looks a lot like The Haunting. I'll talk about The Haunting in a little bit, so I'll come back to that. But brilliant widescreen, beautiful black and white. It was shot by Freddie Francis, who's not someone I know a whole lot about. He did a lot of David Lynch's early work. He did Dune, Straight Story, Elephant Man, as well as Cape Fear. So clearly a very competent cinematographer here, but really just this lavish, beautiful film, very, very gothic, very Victorian. It perfectly encapsulates that Henry James late Victorian aesthetic right before we kind of turn into modernism. And it's not maybe the most scary film on this list, but it is such a brilliant picture, and it is chilling to the bone. Even to this day, there are sequences that I think hold up as genuine pieces of horror. The Woman at the Lake is one that comes to mind, and just the overall feeling of dread that permeates this whole thing is staggering. The next one I want to talk about is an all-time classic. I watch it every year at Christmas because I'm a crazy person, and that is The Exorcist. There's not much to say about The Exorcist that hasn't been said already. It is one of these really interesting horror films that pits the old world, in this case, tradition, religion, in a lot of ways heredity, with the new world, with technology, with science, and it pits these two against each other, the secular and the religious. And the end result is this kind of demonic collision where almost both sides is equally responsible, equally at fault here. We, of course, have the demon who has actually possessed Regan, Pazuzu, but then we also have all the medical world that has let down and is just as horrifying towards Regan as this demon that has possessed her. And then, of course, there's all the stuff with Father Karras, his mother, how the medical treatment failed there, all these things coming back and forth. There's so much to say about The Exorcist. It's a brilliant script by William Peter Blatty and great direction by William Friedkin there. Again, some of the most comprehensive, brilliant horror symbology. Just the poster alone with the priest standing and the street lamp and light spilling out from the window. One of the greatest visuals in film, period, I would argue. And I don't think it's just a great horror film. I think it's a great film in general. That opening in, I believe, Iraq is stunning filmmaking. And of course, people talk about this all the time, but the makeup of Max von Sydow is some of the best in film ever. The next one I want to talk about is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original 1974 film. This is such a visceral picture. From start to end, there is no stop to how gruesome and horrifying this is. We open, of course, with the pictures of the dead bodies, and one of the most iconic pieces of sound design in film for me is the bulb going off in that camera as they take pictures of that. And then just the brilliant visual of the body on the tombstone, that slow zoom out of the graveyard. And then the film just continues from there. A lot of people give this credit as one of the blueprints for slasher films. I don't think that's really true. I think that belongs more to Black Christmas and then later Halloween and Friday the 13th. Because this film is a lot less bloody than you might think going into that. But that's not to say it's not visceral and it's not horrifying. It certainly is. It's one of the most painful, disturbing experiences you will ever have. Without a doubt. The sheer psychological torture that happens in the last 20, 25 minutes of this film are unparalleled in the rest of cinema, truly. And of course, Grandpa with the hammer is one of my favorite scenes ever. This film also has a somewhat humorous, but I think utterly brilliant ending with Leatherface and the chainsaw. One of the greatest final shots, period, in film. I don't know if it has a whole lot to say from a thematic standpoint. It's more just this visceral experience, and that's kind of what makes it so unique. Another film I want to highlight is Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. This is the feature version of the David Lynch, Mark Frost TV show that follows mostly Laura Palmer. Dale Cooper's almost not in it at all. And I don't want to get into it too much because this is one of the few films I kind of don't want to spoil, because I think you should go watch the series and go watch the film and watch The Return and all of that. But it is such a dark examination of the evil people can be driven to, the evil that can just spring up, like most Lynch films, in what seems like safe America, safe urban America. That's all I'm going to say for that. If you disagree with any of these being horror films either, I've just gone to my favorite films on Letterboxd and clicked horror on the genre. And so I'm just kind of going through that way. Some of these I don't think are horror films. The next one that come up is Seconds. I think that's sci-fi, so I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to go directly to another David Lynch film instead, which is Eraserhead. course, Lynch's debut, the cult classic, one of the first midnight movies, just a genuine piece of absolute work. What is there to be said about Eraserhead? It's this otherworldly piece that takes you to this industrial hellscape that feels at the same time foreign and incredibly hauntingly close to home. And it shows you this portrait of domestic isolation that is shockingly real in its depiction, despite its grotesque child, despite its very heightened acting and emotion. There is something visceral and existential about the relationships in Eraserhead between Henry and the child, and between Henry and his lover, as it were. There's something so utterly relatable about this strange cosmic humor that's built into the bizarre and the horrifying situations that we see in every single scene in this. And then, of course, the end with the little song is iconic and brilliant. The next film I want to talk about is Andrei Żuławski's 1981 Possession. This is a film set in Berlin about the decay of a marriage, essentially. And you can already see a metaphor being developed there, but actually the metaphor in Possession is far more complicated and bizarre, as you would expect from Żuławski. And it has to do with this Lovecraftian lover that Sam Neill's wife, Isabella Adjani, has acquired somehow in the city of Berlin here. And it's driven her to madness, and it's split this relationship, and it's obviously a very clear stand-in for the problems in a marriage that lead to divorce and lead to domestic abuse and violence. And there's something to be said for almost tangential toxic masculinity in that there's a lot wrong with Sam Neill's character, and he ends up getting replaced with a doppelganger at the end, almost superseding him as this Ubermensch version of himself. Although even that's a little cloudy and unclear when you get to the end of the film, because, of course, Żuławski doesn't really want to give you answers to your questions. He's very much in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre camp of things, of just creating this very visceral, heart-pounding experience. And the pace in this film does not slow down. It never stops. You're always following someone with heightened emotions, running down streets of Berlin, screaming, stabbing themselves, flinging bags around in the subway. It's a wonderful experience, but you definitely have to be in a certain mood for it. Next film I want to talk about is one that I think is almost siblings to The Innocents, and that is Robert Weiss's The Haunting from 1961. Came out only 2 years later and is eerily similar in a lot of ways. I think the big thing that connects them for me is that kind of widescreen, beautiful, lavish black and white cinematography. The cinematography in this particular film was done by Davis Bolton, who really didn't do much else. And so I think a lot of that camera work we can kind of attribute to Robert Weiss, because a lot of it is echoed in things like West Side Story. This film is an adaptation of the Shirley Jackson book, which is The Haunting of Hill House, I think is the name of the book. And I wrote a really lengthy letterboxed review about this because this is such just an interesting piece to me. This idea that a house is haunted, and not haunted by ghosts, not haunted by whatever, but like haunted by the past. The house itself is the ghost. And they even pose this question inside the film to an extent. They ask, did the man, I can't remember his name, unfortunately, did the man who built the house for his wife imbue it with his evil, or was the house evil and it kind of fed off him and then spit him out in a lot of ways? And If you want more in depth here, go read my review. I talk about the brilliant Jacob Geller video where he was talking about anatomy and all of that. And I talk about that in my Skinamarink review as well, because it's just such a brilliant concept. The next one I want to talk about is Rosemary's Baby. Now, a lot of people understandably have a problem with this film, mostly because of Roman Polanski, which is something I totally respect and understand. I try my best to separate the art from the artist, although it can be hard sometimes, and Polanski's a real creep. That being said, really pretty great director, and I love the way he's able to build mood and tone. So it's really unfortunate that he's just such an asshole. This film, however, is great in its portrayal of paranoia, in its portrayal of not necessarily objectification of women, but this constant threat of violence that women are under in the world at large, even from spouses. John Cassavetes, who plays the spouse in this film, is diabolically evil in his performance, and it's just wonderful. And there's a lot more to be said with this, but that's the basis of the film. Also, this kind of interrogation into almost like The Exorcist, that secular and religious tug and pull that's happening in the modern world, or certainly was around that time in the 60s and 70s and before, without ever really being able to resolve it. Of course, at the end of the film, the Antichrist, or the child of the devil, is born, the child of this dark belief. But you have to ask the question, how will that child fare in a world where most people don't believe anymore? I don't know. It's an interesting idea that's never really explored and isn't really the point of the film, but something worth noting. The next film I want to mention is The Wicker Man. Of course, the original. I'm not talking about the Nick Cage version. This is 1979. Excuse me. Excuse me. And this is such a strange film. The first time I watched it, I utterly hated it. I really did not care for it. And then on a rewatch, it hit me. I think I've rewatched it a couple times now. But my whole perspective on the film genuinely took a 180. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a little too silly. I didn't like all the songs put into it. I didn't like how loose it felt. And it didn't really come together for me at the end, even though that was utterly horrifying. On a second watch, though, suddenly it all began to make sense. This is very much a folk horror film that is made in a folk horror way. And what I mean by that is the tone and the production mirror this kind of folk horror aesthetic, in that it's slightly jovial. It's masked over almost like it's a story being told to children, echoing those kind of dark, grim fairy tales from medieval Europe and so on. And it does this with, like I said, that sing song. We have what's it called? The Innkeeper's Daughter. They sing early on. We have this seductive dance that Britt Ekland gives a little after that. We, of course, have all the masks, all the parts of the ritual that make it feel, parts of Mayday that make it feel like a genuine piece of custom, piece of culture. And it kind of distracts us. This looser, happier aesthetic builds and builds and builds until we reach the end of the film, and that catharsis is utterly horrifying in how isolating it leaves us. And it leaves us terrified. It's horrifying. It's one of the darkest endings to a film ever, and that's completely understandable when you've had this buildup and when you begin to understand the implications of what happens at the end as well. To become a martyr for something that is so flimsy is truly one of the most haunting ideas there is. Moving on, I'm going to talk about a little lesser known film. It's a Czech film called The Cremator. It's from 1969. black and white, and it's about the man who is commissioned to help design the furnaces that are used in concentration camps. And he's a cremator, and most of the film follows this slow fall into madness as he loses touch with reality, loses his mind, and is subjected to so many pieces of propaganda that his whole understanding of the world completely flips. He's cut off from his empathy, he's cut off from his humanity, and develops this toxic worldview that festers inside him and eventually leads him to this horrific and it's maybe not as direct as some other horror films. It's much more along the lines of like a Taxi Driver or something. But it does bring that horror of manipulation and that horror of propaganda that is so accurate to our modern world in how subtle it is at inching our worldview one direction or another without us even realizing it. And of course, that's very topical in the world we're in right now, where we are constantly inched closer and closer to a very destructive worldview and a very destructive understanding of the world, a hateful one, where hate is so easily propagated and given to others and cultivated within us by a very uncaring society. And I think that's why it's a very important film, as well as being a very unnerving, very horrifying one. The other thing I really want to highlight from The Cremator is its editing. The use of match cuts in this film is unprecedented, I think, in any other film. It's cut super quickly, but the way it match cuts between different scenes is something you don't see in almost any other film. So it's worth a watch for that. Next one I'm going to bring up, and I think I'll only do 4 more here, mostly because I want to go to sleep. But next one I'm going to bring up is Martin from 1977. This is a little-known George A. Romero film. It's a vampire film, or pseudo-vampire film, that follows a young boy named Martin who's convinced he's a vampire. He goes to live with his nephew, who's also convinced he's a vampire. It's never clear if he is or not, but he definitely breaks into people's houses and kills them, takes their blood. And it's just incredibly brutal in the most 70s way, in the most detached, cold way, where you're looking in through the window and you're watching all these horrible, unsettling events, violent events happening, and there's nothing you can do about it. And of course, that's a huge part of the theme of the film, is this detachment from the violence, from the understanding. Martin is convinced through family lore, if you will, family media, that he is a vampire and that he has to do these things. Now, it's never clear if he is or not, and that doesn't really matter. The idea is how these stories around us shape us, and similar to The Cremator, how these stories around us can lead us to violence if we're not careful. A deeply unsettling film, but it's also a deeply melancholic film, which should be no surprise coming from George Romero. Not as heavy on the social commentary as you might think. It's more a character study of Martin and of his nephew and of his nephew's, I can't remember how they're related. I want to say daughter, but I don't think that's the case. And this kind of investigation of heredity and what traits are inherited and what traits are up to you to choose. It's kind of that nature versus nurture debate in a lot of ways. Next film I want to highlight is an all-time classic. It's the original A Nightmare on Elm Street. I cannot overstate how horrifying this film is. I love it. It's so cool and fun. It has some of the best effects of all time. It has some of the greatest sequences of all time, some of the greatest imagery of all time. I can go on and on and on. But at the core of it, there is a deeply horrifying idea, which is this idea that you're not safe in your dreams. Sleeping is one of the places where you want to be safe. It's one of the places we demand safety. We need safety because it's where we're our most vulnerable, where we're our least protected. And here is an idea where not only can someone enter your dream, someone can harm you in your dream. And not only that, it's someone who wants to harm you, someone who is a child molester and wants to harm you, and someone who is a child molester who wants to harm you, who is practically a god in this dream world. So you have layer upon layer upon layer of some of the most deeply unsettling, horrific things that could ever come together. And then you couple it with brilliant direction, great acting, great script, and of course the effects. Freddy pushing through the ceiling very early on, all the floating and laceration. You have the Johnny Depp scene, which is great. A lot of people like to criticize the end of this film as cheesy or sequel baity. I don't mind it. I think it kind of works. I understand that we've gone through the arc and it doesn't make sense that Freddy would come back like this in terms of classical story structure. But I think the idea that we're kind of all living in this dream, and the idea that Freddy is so powerful that he understands the illusion of the real world and kind of can come in and out. It's retconned in the sequels or whatever, but this first film is brilliant. And actually, a lot of the sequels are quite good as well. I don't quite care for 2 or 6. I think the rest are pretty great, though, and honestly worth a watch. 2 is worth a watch, too, but skip 6. Definitely skip 6. Second to last one I want to talk about here is The Evil Dead, the original, the Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell classic from 1981. This is such a great film. I don't have a whole lot to say. It's just the effects, the fear, the visceral fear of it, and also the kind of early balance of comedy without going full into camp and losing a piece of itself. There's of course the tree essay scene, which maybe doesn't need to be in there, but does reinforce how visceral and haunting this kind of film is. The last one I want to talk about today, I know I've rambled on for a while with basically no reason here, but it's Phantom of the Paradise from 1974, one of the other kind of first midnight movies, big cult film that has developed. And this is such a fascinating film. The title kind of gives a lot away. We're taking Phantom of the Opera, both the original story, the film, and then the Broadway show version of it as well. We're combining it with Faust and we're combining it with Dorian Gray. So we've got all these layers of classic storytelling melding together. And what it kind of does is it plays with a lot of those ideas. Because instead of us following Faust, Faust is our antagonist for the film. Swan is the antagonist of the film, of course. And Winslow becomes the Phantom of the Paradise, the Phantom of the Opera protagonist of the film. And there's kind of this weird dichotomy. So instead of empathizing or following Faust, we are directly opposing him, which makes a lot more sense when you consider the story of Faust and what kind of person he is. And the deal he makes is this kind of Dorian Gray deal, and that's how that ties in. But what really makes, excuse me, what really makes this film for me is the music that kind of fits with the Brian De Palma directing. The music in this film is great. It's done by Paul Williams, who also plays Swan. And of course, for all those Muppets fans out there, Paul Williams is an all-time legend. The music in this is just as good as the Muppets, if not better in a lot of ways. Hell of It is one of my favorite songs just ever. I love it so much. But that kind of whimsical 50s into 60s into 70s meld of music mixed with that very hyper fast 70s Brian De Palma type directing with the split screen and the spinning cameras and all these different tricks that he kind of stole from Hitchcock and reappropriated really creates this unique atmosphere. It's not really a horror movie. It kind of is, but it's really kind of this examination of the rock industry at the time, and through investigating the rock industry, it investigates, of course, the film industry. The kind of point of the film, in my or in my understanding, is to take the music industry and use it as a metaphor for the film industry, and see how people in power kind of misabuse their situations to take advantage of young, impressionable people, to do all these different things, and to also steal and appropriate others' work. And of course, that's just brilliant. It's great. It's so much fun. Worth a watch if you haven't seen it. That's it for me for this video. I know I've just kind of been ranting on for a while now. It's been, 30 minutes? I hope you enjoyed. I hope you can get something out of this. Leave your favorite horror films down in the comments below. Just really love celebrating the October season, and thanks to all the new subscribers I've had. Feel free to engage, to reach out and all of that. I hope you guys have a happy Halloween.